to basically just look like female humans dressed up as trolls. Apparently, Karen Bloodhoof was a level 100 warrior when put into the game for the first time, which is funny because he did not survive long enough to make it to Draenor, and had the title Hail to the King, baby, which is obviously a reference to the Wrath of the Lich King achievement of the same name as part of Children's Week, and totally not a reference to some other video game. The Juggernaut in the Dead Mines was originally supposed to be outside and not in a cave. I also remember reading somewhere that it was supposed to be like 2 times larger than what was put in game, but they made it smaller to fit inside. Although I don't remember where I read that from, so it could be wrong. A female human riding a wyvern, since griffins weren't animated in the game yet. You can also see that all of the icons it has that aren't from Warcraft 3 are just gold T's, which I assume stand for test icon or something. Also, the name of the human, Vides, is one of the lead game designers at the time, who was known as Tygol Vides in EverQuest, where he and his guild got many world first achievements before working for Blizzard. There was also an item called Tygol's Trash Bringer, which was a test item put in the DK starting zone during its early development before being removed. It looks like Tygol liked to put his name on early development work. In this next image, you can see the very first map of Arathi Basin, jokingly called the Atari map. It's pretty recognizable if you've ever done Arathi Basin. The yellow squares are the 5 capture points. The farm is next to the Horde starting gate, the stables next to the Alliance, the blacksmith in the middle, surrounded by water, the lumber mill elevated to the left, and the mines below sea level to the right. And this next picture is Arathi Basin in 3D. It looks very similar to how it looks today, except it looks like the building for the blacksmith looks more like a chapel. So maybe it was supposed to be called something else back then, before being turned into the blacksmith. The first test fight against Onyxia. Everything in the picture looks pretty close to Vanilla WoW, except of course for the QA menu below the minimap. Also, if you look at Onyxia closely, you can see arrows sticking out of her body, which were not there when WoW went live. Maybe WoW had a system where enemies looked more damaged the longer you fought them, which would be a sweet feature to have even today. The birth of Onyxia. In this image, she has the model of a standard black dragon, and not the unique model she had in the previous image. But then again, this screenshot was taken before the other one. A few things to note about this image. The name of the dwarf warrior fighting Onyxia is Tygol. Again, another thing in early development with the name of Tygol in it. Also, the weapon in the one slot to the action bars is the model for Tibu's blazing longsword. If you look closely at the weapon the dwarf is holding, it only confirms this theory as it's a glowing red color. Tibu's blazing longsword is an epic item from Vanilla WoW that has the weapon model of a red lightsaber, and is the only weapon on the vanilla box art with its item description both shown and its effect animated while it's being used to fight something. The fact that it shows up on this image shows that Blizzard has had a hard-on for this weapon for quite some time. First Molten Core raid ever. Apparently it was just part of the BRD dungeon and wasn't supposed to be its own raid. Can you imagine that? BRD is already one of the longest dungeons ever, and they wanted to add Molten Core to it on top of that? They must have really been going for the 12-hour long dungeon crawl fantasy. Which, now that I think about it, does sound pretty sweet in theory, but I can't see Blizzard pulling that off in practice. The first test fight of Blackwing Lair. Notice all the dead bodies on the floor? Razorgore was so hard for a first boss to a raid that it killed many guilds who could never get past it, let alone the boss after it, who was even harder. Blackwing Lair is why we have easy bosses as the first boss in each raid today, and generally not terribly hard second bosses either. When you look at the name of the dwarf in this image, it's Tygol again. Tygol is everywhere. Anyways, this was just the first draft of Undercity. I know the text in the image says it's supposed to look like wrecked Lordaeron and not necessarily what Undercity looks like today, but this model is pretty close to what Undercity looks like, so I don't really get what they're talking about. I guess maybe they didn't intend Lordaeron to be as wrecked as it is today, or maybe they had planned to build an actual city above ground instead of underneath, like they ended up doing. That'd be pretty cool. Lordaeron in lore was supposed to be a huge, big, important city. It was basically the Stormwind of the Human Alliance in the north. And finally, an early development picture of Cthulhu. Doesn't he look cute? Cthulhu we got in game is basically just a more detailed giant purple eyeball, but the one in this picture looks too cute to be a terrifying old god, so I can see why they changed it big time. Alright, and that's it for the earliest screenshots in WoW. This collection of images literally shows up every couple of months on the WoW subreddit. I couldn't really think of another way to incorporate them into a video, rather than just talk about each image like I did. Ten weapons that appeared in WoW's game files at one point or another, but were never made available to players for whatever reason. First up, we've got Frostmourne. Frostmourne was actually in the game files since WoW's launch, but was never shown in-game until Wrath of the Lich King's expansion in 2008.
And I know you will show restraint when exercising your great power.
With the official lore behind the weapon being that it was destroyed by Tyrion, it's very unlikely to ever be obtainable by players, especially since Frost Death Knights take the remains of the broken sword to make their artifact weapons. The sword in the game files is the only weapon in game with a meta socket on it. For those of you who probably don't remember, meta sockets were only ever in helms and could only be socketed with special meta gems, which were stronger than normal gems. But they don't appear on any new pieces of gear anymore since Warlords of Draenor. The weapon also gives you a Lich King buff, presumably changing your armor to that of the Lich King's. Or maybe it would actually turn you into the Lich King, making you hostile to everyone until you were killed by your friends. Maybe it would even delete your character once you die, since the weapon in lore does consume your soul. That's probably why it was never made available to players. And totally not because it's the most iconic weapon in the game, wielded by one of the most popular villains ever.
Let them come. Frostmourne hungers.
The next weapon, called Shard of the Defiler, is a legendary dagger. It supposedly has the ability to turn your character model into a demon, and gives a passive 15% melee attack speed boost and crit chance. When it was very first data mined in vanilla WoW, it also did some of its melee damage as shadow damage, which would have been interesting because, as far as I know, there has never been a melee weapon in game that has done magical damage. There was once a quest item dagger in the beta version of the Burning Crusade that did arcane damage instead of physical damage, and mages in beta were able to get it to insane levels of damage, making battle mages a real and overpowered thing. But that never made it to life, and neither did this dagger. Some speculation on the dagger was that it was supposed to be part of the original Hyjal raid from vanilla WoW, not the battle for Mount Hyjal added in BC. For those of you who don't know, the zone of Hyjal was blocked off all the way until Cataclysm, when it was turned into a leveling zone. And there were rumors that Blizzard had plans for some kind of raid there, since while the zone was not accessible to players, it was fully textured and even had the skeleton of Archimonde in the tree for a while. A lot of effort was put into the zone, but it was never used for anything, and his dagger might have been a reward from the scrap zone, seeing as its name can be traced back to Archimonde, and it gave a demon appearance. Next up, we've got Thunder Fury, Blessed Blade of the Windseeker deprecated. Now, Thunder Fury, Blessed Blade of the Windseeker is a legendary very much in the game, but this weapon, Thunder Fury, Blessed Blade of the Windseeker deprecated, has the same stats as the regular Thunder Fury, Blessed Blade of the Windseeker, just without the chance on hit effect, or any model data. But what's interesting about Thunder Fury, Blessed Blade of the Windseeker deprecated is that it has always required you to be level 100 to equip it. Way back, years ago, before Warlords of Draenor was even a thought in the developers' minds, and the max level was still 60. Most of the weapons in this video will either not have a weapon requirement, or have one appropriate to the time the weapon was added to the game. Thunder Fury, Blessed Blade of the Windseeker deprecated is probably the first weapon ever put into the game files that had the level requirement of 100. The next weapon on this video is actually a fishing pole. Crafty's pole is the only legendary fishing pole in the game files. It only requires a level 1 in fishing to use, and gives you 1,000 skill increase in fishing. The pole was most likely used to test fishing, and probably still is to some extent today. The fishing pole has the flavor text that says, Just holding this fishing pole makes you shiver with excitement. This is possibly the most amazing thing you've ever seen. Most items not made available to players don't have any kind of flavor text. In fact, a lot of items in game don't have flavor text either. There's also an offhand in the game that you can catch by fishing in Orgrimmar called Old Crafty, which this pole is probably a reference to. With the flavor text said to be the craftiest fish in Orgrimmar, it appears he was outsmarted at last. Funny enough, there was a bug for a while that wouldn't allow players to actually loot Old Crafty when he was caught, making it a very elusive to catch fish indeed, really living up to its flavor text. Data mined in vanilla, the original twin blades of Azzinoth followed lore a lot more closely than that to the warglaives that did make it into the game and drop vanilla. The twin blades were a weapon that had an on-use effect, which would split the weapon into two separate weapons, called the warglaive of Azzinoth right and left. Its equip effect was pretty similar to the effects of the warglaives in game. Extra melee haste and bonus damage when fighting demons. These never-added warglaives also had the same model as the warglaives the Demon Hunter on the box art for vanilla WoW is using. Maybe indicate don't have any kind of flavor text. In fact, a lot of items in game don't have flavor text either. There's also an offhand in the game that you can catch by fishing in Orgrimmar called Old